Warning, censorship. Warning, censorship.
James O'Keefe of Project Veritas has a new book called American Muckraker, Rethinking Journalism for the 21st Century. He joins me now. James, how are you doing? Thanks for joining me.
Great to be with you.
I've asked independent journalists, I think for the last couple of years now, what the future of news media looks like. It's all in this book. Individuals with a camera, small sites, news aggregations. What do you see being, the leading form of news media going forward as so many of these big organizations fail?
Great question. I think the future of journalism is citizens. Even if we're censored and banned, which we are, Project Veritas is banned on Twitter, it's releasing information the public cannot ignore. It's releasing information, to quote the former Viacom chairman, that content is king. In other words, if the story is strong enough, it will effuse and disseminate itself throughout all of the forms of medium, even Twitter. And the case in point is the story we did last week on the DARPA documents, right? This story was the #1 trending story on Twitter, even though I was banned on Twitter. That's because the documents were so sensational. And journalists cannot, especially citizen journalists, you shouldn't ask us to trust us by virtue of the fact that you should. That's what the New York Times and Washington Post does when they say people familiar with the matter. You don't know who those sources are. They're asking you to trust them. We don't ask you to trust me. We show you the evidence for your own eyes and ears. It's called first-person observation journalism. This book takes you through that. They used to do it in the 20th century. Muckraker is going back to Upton Sinclair. And then you had the Chicago Sun-Times, the 1970s, Mike Wallace, 60 Minutes, 1980s. And then in the 1990s, it sort of fell out of favor. And then with the rise of the oligarchy in the 2000s, with the big tech firms deciding what you should see and not see, this book provides solutions on how you can circumvent the censorship and break through with whistleblowing.
Now, with the DARPA documents and the undercover video from the pharmaceutical companies, after that, the Pfizer CEO called it dark companies recovering them. He said misinformation. He says he's in danger of being, hacked. What exactly is it about them that they don't want to disclose to the public? It seems like they're afraid to give certain information. Things trickle out. Things get leaked. What exactly are these big companies that are, they're projected as these great life-saving companies that care so much about us? What do you think is going on that they don't want the public to actually see? There seems to be a lack of communication from these companies.
Well, that's exactly right. There was a document that was given to us by a Pfizer employee. Her name was Melissa. This is back in October. And the document was an email from Senior Director, rather. Her name was Vanessa Gelman. And Vanessa Gelman said in the private correspondence at Pfizer, they don't want the public to know about the fetal cells being used in the development of the Pfizer vaccine. Now, I guess fetal cells are used in the development of a lot of vaccines, but the question was, why did Pfizer not want you to know that? And that is the whole point of journalism, right? To make public that which powerful people want kept hidden. That's the whole point. So people say, well, James O'Keefe is promoting disinformation. Well, I didn't make these claims. These were not my statements or my opinions. These were statements from, admittedly, the senior director, Vanessa Gelman at Pfizer. After that video and another video showing a scientist at Pfizer, a guy with a PhD in biology, he was caught on tape saying that the antibodies are stronger than Pfizer's own vaccine. So it was my duty as a journalist to publish this information. And a few weeks later, you have the CEO of Pfizer come out in that clip you're referencing and say that there's dark groups. He's clearly referencing Project Veritas. And that he's working with the FBI and the CIA. It remains unknown why pharmaceutical companies are talking to the FBI about me. A document came out just 2 days ago from Judicial Watch confirming that the FBI has communications. Also, it's crazy the FBI has admitted this. So we're living in these bizarre times. And I think it's important for people to know not only how bad it is, but there is hope. There's hope because there's a lot of good people inside these organizations, and I can't emphasize that enough. We just need to give them the option to blow the whistle and talk about that process of blowing the whistle, what it takes to get through that, and what recourse these truth tellers have.
Now, when I was watching you on Tim Pool recently, you talked about journalists needing to step it up and ask the tough questions. A lot of what we see, especially here in Canada, is journalists, piggybacking on what the politicians are saying, not asking anything critical. here it's conservative and liberal parties that are getting softball treatment left and right. What do you think is the reason why there's so few journalists and publications out there willing to step up and ask these questions? We saw some of the first tough questions, I think, in a long time being posed to Biden the other day. They were from Newsmax, I think Real Clear Politics, not these big companies with billions of dollars. What's stopping them from asking these tough questions, do you think?
Great question. I think it goes back. There's a chapter in this book, American Muckraker, about the history of the medium. To quote, you're in Toronto. To quote the late Marshall McLuhan, who wrote a book called "The Medium is the Message." I really think that images are more powerful than the politician. But with what happened in the news media, there's always been this tension between autonomy and access. There's been a collision between getting too cozy with your sources. And I think what's happened in newspapers, particularly the New York Times and Washington Post, which basically have an oligopoly or a monopoly on journalism, in quotes, is that they've gotten way too close to these people in these administrative agencies. And they've gotten too close to the pharmaceutical companies. And that's self-evident because on the commercial breaks on television, you hear, brought to you by Pfizer, brought to you by Pfizer. There's a great clip of Good Morning America and CNN, brought to you by Pfizer. Can you imagine if I laser or a suit that had all of the companies that give me money, like a NASCAR driver? That's what they do. And you almost kind of like, you grow up and you take this for granted as kids. We see all these commercials, but then you realize, wait a second, that they're owned by these people. They can't bite the hand that feeds them. And they project onto you at Rebel News and me at Project Veritas that they think that we're the ones who are owned by these moneyed interests. And so it's a projection thing. It's a psychological thing. It's very manipulative for them to say that when they literally are paid by pharmaceutical companies and then they defend them. That's the world we're living in right now.
Speaking of pharmaceutical sponsors, I want to get your take on CNN. Rick Salibi, all the claims that happen over CNN over the last few years. Why, and I ask this question often, usually in the past you'd see after, bad election coverage, for example, new hosts coming in, new personalities coming in because the last one's got it wrong. There doesn't seem to be any responsibility taken at MSNBC, CNN, and the like when they get so many things wrong or when they're involved in disturbing scandals like this producer. Why is there no responsibility here? Why is Don Lemon not gone? Why are these people who tank in the ratings not gone?
Why are they not gone? That's an existential question. But let me give you a very interesting anecdote that your audience is going to be fascinated by. We did a story on Rick Salibi. A sex worker came out. This is a guy who was the producer for Jake Tapper, not the first pedophile guy. That guy, Crippen, when Connecticut was dealt with. This is a second guy now. In December, a former, I guess, sex worker prostitute came forward, and she's now working for a social welfare organization. And she had recordings of Rick Salibi recently, who was asking for pictures of her 15-year-old daughter and also had sexual fantasies about Rick Salibi's fiance. This guy's a fiance, about his fiance's daughter. And worse, I can't even say on the program here what I've seen and these things that were happening. So we break the story, and CNN secretly, Rick Salibi secretly resigns or was fired that same day or within 24 hours, and CNN wouldn't say a peep about it. And that was very manipulative of Jeff Zucker of CNN. He knew that by announcing the firing or the resignation, it would have generated global news. But weeks later, Matt Dornick, the vice president of CNN, put out like a reply tweet saying, oh, yeah, that's old news. He left weeks ago. And that was the first time anybody had heard that Rick Salibi left. So this is propaganda. This is manipulation. And there's no accountability because of the cartel. No other journalist would report on this information. Ben Smith at the New York Times, media columnist, knew about it, but he didn't report it. So the question is, you have a cartel, a system-supported propaganda network that manufactures consent, to quote Noam Chomsky. And our country, the United States, is premised on the fact that you have to have access to information the powers that be don't want you to have. And the only people who can do that are people on the outside, people who are independent citizens. Now, some of them, as this book gets into, are also on the inside. The people like you and I who work for the Department of Justice or the Department of Defense or Google or Pinterest or the Postal Service. These are the honest men and women in our country, and they alone have the power to break through this cartel. And that's what this book talks about. It talks about their stories and what they had to endure to do it.
I love particularly the mail fraud. Well, I'll be careful with my words on YouTube, but the videos with the Postal Service workers from last year. Last question, James. I want to get anything you can tell us about the FBI and this diary and all that stuff's going on. Can you give us any updates? I mean, it's a crazy story, and I know so many things can't be said because of what's being involved, but there's so many crazy allegations. What updates can you give us, if any, on this stuff with the FBI coming and raiding Project Veritas?
Well, I can tell you everything. It's just a matter of the time constraint that I have here. I can write a whole book about that. But effectively, the FBI raided my home in February 6th of last year, and they confiscated my 2 iPhones. They had a search warrant signed by a magistrate judge in the Southern District of New York. And the crimes listed on the search warrant, these are crimes either I may have committed or someone I knew may have committed, according to them, included accessory after the fact and misprision of a felony, which is absurd to charge us to level an American journalist. The Supreme Court of the United States in Bartnicki v. Bopper protects the right of a journalist to publish a document that is transmitted to me, even if that document was stolen by a third party. In this case, we don't think it was stolen. Even if it was, we were within our rights to publish Ashley Biden's diary. But I chose not to publish the president's daughter's diary because I couldn't fully authenticate that it was hers, and I couldn't fully authenticate this allegation of inappropriate showers with her dad, whether that even happened. So the question remains, why did the feds raid a home of an American journalist? The federal judge in New York rejecting the prosecutor's arguments that I'm not a journalist. In fact, the federal judge appointed a special master over the FBI. They still have my phones. They have those phones, but now there is an independent person involved in this matter, and the ACLU and other groups have come to our defense. In fact, there still is some overlap between the left and the right, because this was an instance where it really shocked everyone that they did this, and I think it shows some desperation that they would want to do this to an American reporter, and I think it's going to eventually bring people together. I think they overstep their bounds is going to inspire more people to come to us because it shows just how much of a threat to the established narrative Project Veritas is.
Is there any other big stuff in that diary, this alleged Ashley Biden diary, that you think people want to know about? Will they find out what's in it, do you think?
Well, yes, the diary was published actually by someone else. Apparently, the other people had gotten a copy of the diary. Other sources had seen the diary. And I think it was published by an obscure website, and it's all on the internet there. I chose not to publish it. Again, I was almost certain it was hers. I didn't want to take the chance. And people accuse me of being a right-wing activist and this and that, but if I really was a right-wing activist, I would have published the diary without empathy or concern about the impacts of whether it's true or whether it was even hers. And I think the more important question in this issue is, what could an ethical journalist, what can an ethical human being do if you stumble across a piece of information, try to corroborate it, fail to, and don't take action, you still get raided by the feds? I mean, this is a dystopian nightmare. This is beyond Orwell. Now we're living in a Kafkaesque nightmare where this sort of thing happens. And that's you're going to suffer if you do this work. You're going to go through the psychological stuff that you go through. But it's important people to understand the stories. It's important people to know there is a hopeful arc to this story, that you too can get through it. You can't give up. You can't quit. You can't live in fear. It's a very dangerous thing to live in fear, especially when you're trying to do journalism.
All right. I think it's important to tell you, James, how much we appreciate your work. I mean, I'm sure I'm just a guy in Toronto doing a show, but all across the world, people appreciate the work you guys are doing. So much for the election, particularly stands out, and now the vaccines, and of course, the Bidens and everything going on with that. American Muckraker is the book. James, I could ask you questions probably for 2 hours. I hope you'll come back and do the rest of the gamut here for Andrew, myself. But I appreciate your time, and anything else you want to say to our audience, we'll let you go right after that.
Well, I appreciate you and Ezra, and I also want to say that this book took me 5 years to write. All proceeds go to our nonprofit called Project Veritas. We're a 501c3 tax-deductible American charity. So by buying this book, you're supporting our organization and you're helping pay the salaries of our journalists. So we appreciate you having us on, taking the time. Please pick up a copy anywhere books are sold.
Thanks a lot, James. Have a great day.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to go to rebelnews.com. We've got tons of daily articles for you to browse, and rebelnewsplus.com for all your premium content that you don't want to miss.